It's summer in Europe, and after years of disrupted travel due to the pandemic, tourism is well and truly back on. I'm embarking on my own hot girl Euro summer, but with a twist. I'm following in the footsteps of the original tourists, the posh young Englishmen of the 18th century, who took part in a coming-of-age travel tradition known as the Grand Tour. In a time before planes, trains, and automobiles, the Grand Tour was a sometimes grueling trip across Europe via boat, horse and carriage, and on foot, where young gentlemen would venture out of the comforts of their own home to see the most important sights on the continent. My journey will take me to Paris, down through France, and across the Swiss Alps to Italy, where the young gentlemen of the British aristocracy saw the art and architecture of the ancient world, bought the latest fashions in menswear, and got into trouble with the local ladies, all in the name of education. But first, I need to get the hell out of England.
Before Heathrow and the Eurostar, if you wanted to cross the English Channel, you had to make the journey from London to Dover and catch a boat. And this was no pleasant journey. It took days. One author named Tobias Smollett wrote in 1766 that along the road to Dover, the accommodation was cold and comfortless, the beds paltry, the cooking execrable, the wine poison, the attendance bad, the publicans insolent, and the bills extortion. Good old Tobias Smollett was known for being a bit of a grumpy traveller. In fact, another author named Lawrence Sterne satirised him in a character called Smell Fungus, who complained non-stop during his travels abroad in his novel A Sentimental Journey Through France and Italy. And because of this book, a smell fungus became a popular term for a grumpy traveller, or someone who looks for faults in everything. Over the course of this series, we're going to be coming across quite a few smell fungi, because as it happens, a lot of Brits who embarked on the Grand Tour of France and Italy in the 18th and 19th centuries like to have a bit of a whinge. They complained about the food, the weather, the people, and the cities. And when the average Grand Tour lasted more than a year, that's a lot of time to keep up all that complaining. Our first stop, though, is perhaps the most complained about destination on the Grand Tour. Because as we know today, if there's one place the English love to hate and hate to love, it's France. I will be bold to affirm that France is the general reservoir from which all the absurdities of false taste, luxury, and extravagance have overflowed. The springs that fill this reservoir are none other than vanity and ignorance. That was Tobias Smollett for you again. In the 18th century, the most popular tourist destination for British travellers was France. And by France, I of course mean Paris. But not all Brits were impressed by the city of love. In 1765, Horace Walpole wrote, "It is the ugliest, beastliest town in the universe." And the painter Benjamin Haydon described Paris as a filthy hole. In their defence, we have to remember that the Paris of the Grand Tour era didn't look like this. This iconic Parisian streetscape that we know and love today was the work of Georges-Eugène Haussmann in the mid to late 19th century. He was a French official who bulldozed great swathes of narrow medieval streets to make way for these grand open boulevards, which were not only supposed to reduce crime and squalor, but also make it harder for residents to barricade the streets in armed revolts. Didn't that work out well? But back in the 18th century, Paris was cramped, dark, filthy. The city didn't have a proper sewage system, and disease was very common. Not only did the English tourists find the City of Lights to be rather dark and grimy, but they also found the general customs of the French to be somewhat repugnant. They didn't like their manners, they didn't like their customs, and most of all, they didn't like their religion, Catholicism. Here's a quick refresher on the religious context of the 18th century. England was largely Protestant, while France and Italy were largely Catholic. Historian Jeremy Black writes that the religious and political tension between England, France, and Italy was especially important during the Grand Tour. To visit France, he writes, was to visit the national enemy, and Italy, the site of the papal government, was a source of ideological challenge. It was as if the prime destinations of American tourists at the height of the Cold War had been the Soviet Union and China. But despite all of these political and religious tensions, there was one French thing that the English couldn't get enough of: their fashion. What these French fashion-obsessed young Englishmen would do is, as soon as they got to Paris, they would order an entirely new wardrobe for themselves and have it custom made. This love-hate relationship the English had for the French, adoring their couture, but despising their culture and religion and customs, caused a bit of internal conflict for the Poms, a conflict that was made even harder in periods when England and France were actively at war with each other, which happened actually quite frequently. My favourite example of this is found in a poem written at the start of the 7 Years' War, which began in 1756 and lasted, you guessed it, 7 years. Poet James Cawthorne wrote, "By some malignancy of fate, we take our fashions from the land we hate." Other activities besides shopping in Paris were lessons in horse riding, dancing and fencing, all very important skills for a young gentleman to learn. From Paris, grand tourists would usually make their way south towards the Swiss Alps, beyond which lay Italy, the holy grail of 18th century travel. But in order to get there, some pretty serious challenges lay in their path. Firstly, wolves. I wish I was kidding. Today, rural France is known for wine, cheese, and rich English people doing chateau DIYs. But back in the day, France was home to one of the largest wolf populations in Europe. And between the 17th and 18th centuries, it's possible that up to 9,000 people died in wolf attacks in the region. Throughout France and Switzerland, wolves were also known to attack travellers. Horace Walpole's Black Spaniel was eaten by wolves as he crossed the Alps. No wonder he was so cranky. Oh, and the other problem? This huge mountain range. The Swiss Alps are a beautiful tourist destination in their own right today, but in the 18th century, travellers didn't look at these icy peaks and marvel at their beauty. They looked upon them with dread. Crossing the Alps was a perilous journey. There were no proper roads and trains hadn't been invented yet, so your only choice was to go by foot. There was, of course, a far safer route to Italy, down through the south coast of France to Genoa, but these young gents of the Grand Tour era wanted to prove their masculinity and their endurance by crossing the Alps, not skirting around them. So what did they do? Paid someone to carry them over, of course. For a fee, grand tourists could hire carrymen who would strap them into a sedan chair and transport them over the mountains toot sweet. Now, I personally see that as cheating, so I have no qualms at all about taking the scenic route through the Alps myself. As it turns out, masculinity was a pretty important part of doing an 18th century grand tour. Embarking on a gap year in Europe was supposed to make you manly. It was supposed to equip you with the skills of independence and self-reliance, with resilience and with courage. In 1670, Richard Lascelles, who I like to think of as a sort of late 17th century Jordan Peterson, wrote a whole preface to his book Voyage of Italy about how important travel was in the development of a young man. He wrote that travel wains the young man from the fondness of his mother. It teacheth him wholesome hardship, to lie in beds that are none of his acquaintance, to endure any horse or weather. Travelling makes my young nobleman 4 notches lower in his self-conceit and pride. Of course, as a lady traveller myself, I can't relate at all. Of all the towns in Italy, I am the least satisfied with Venice. Old and ill-built houses, and stinking ditches dignified with the pompous denomination of canals, a fine bridge spoilt by 2 rows of houses on it, and a large square decorated with the worst architecture I ever yet saw. Don't know what he was looking at. After weeks, if not months, of trekking across the continent and over the Swiss Alps, the 18th century grand tourist finally reached the holy grail of their itinerary, Italy. But when grand tourists finally reached Italy, they were horrified by what they saw. What shocked them so much about Italy, you ask? Was it the stunning architecture? The treasures of history? No, they were shocked to see Genoese and Venetian women openly conducting romantic affairs with 1 or more men who weren't their husbands. These young men were called cicisbe, and according to one 18th century writer, their duties were to receive her ladyship's daily instructions, run up and down the town upon her errands, carry compliments and how to use, and execute her commands with the most religious exactitude. Not only did these ladies' husbands know about these sanctioned lovers, but they often actively encouraged them. And just in case they didn't, some Venetian women even had it written into their marriage contracts that they would be allowed to keep 1 or more cicisbe during their marriage.
This setup came about for a couple of practical reasons. Firstly, back in the 17th and 18th centuries, noble women needed to have a chaperone when they left the house, and so a cicisbeo helped these women exercise a bit more freedom in their day-to-day lives. And secondly, because it was only the eldest son in the family who inherited all the money and property, a practice known as primogeniture, there were a lot of young gents floating about who needed a job.
This open and legal arrangement horrified the English gents who visited Venice as part of their grand tours of Europe. Mostly because they were worried that English women would go travelling and come back with ideas. Here's what the same travel writer from before had to say about this issue. I'm apt to think that our northern husbands would knit their brows and be a little uneasy if their wives assumed half the liberty that the Genoese ladies look upon as their right. Our ladies have had the pleasure hitherto to think themselves privileged in England, but it's well if some of our female travellers don't hereafter bring home contraband notions and help to stir up a matrimonial war in the nation to the disturbance of many of His Majesty's good subjects. And to prevent this disorder, I would have every wife that has been abroad be obliged to renew her original act of allegiance and duty to her husband as soon as she ever lands at Dover or any other part of the kingdom. How's that for passport control? This moral panic about the cicisbei was pretty hypocritical though, if you ask me, considering what the English gents loved to get up to while they were in cities like Venice. Because one of the biggest tourist drawcards of the city on the swamp were Venice's sex workers. The English writer and pioneer of the Grand Tour, Thomas Coyret, wrote, "There were 2,000 courtesans in the city, whereof many are esteemed so loose that they are said to open their quiver to every arrow." He probably embellished those numbers a bit, but it's certainly true that Venice became so well known for parties and sex that a big fear for mums and dads back home was that their son would come back from his grand tour with a sexually transmitted disease. Or worse, a gold-digging new wife. I finally made it to Rome, the most hyped stop on an 18th century grand tour bucket list. It's hot as balls and absolutely packed full of tourists. According to one 18th century travel writer, the population of Rome is 1/4 priests, 1/4 statues, and 1/4 people who do nothing. As for the last quarter, he didn't say, but I'd hazard a guess that today the tourists outnumber the statues 1,000 to 1. In crowds like these, it's very tempting to think that you're not like the other tourists. But as it turns out, people have always loved to complain about other tourists. For example, an English travel writer named Augustus Haar wrote in 1871, near the end of the era of the Grand Tour, that nothing can be more depressing to those who really value Rome than to meet Englishmen hunting in couples through the Vatican galleries, one looking for the number of the statue in the guidebook and the other not finding it. For Augustus, it was those other English tourists crowding up the cities of Italy that were the problem, not him. So what were the proper grand tourists doing in Rome? Well, when these horny young gents took a break from the parties and the ladies, they liked to sit around and measure their columns. 18th century tourists absolutely frothed an ancient Roman monument. But there was one thing they loved more: measuring an ancient Roman monument. That's right, imagine spending your gap year meticulously measuring the size of every arch, column and statue you come across using only a tape measure and a quadrant. And that's not all. These young gents would compare notes with fellow travellers and grand tourists and argue over whose measurement was more accurate. One young gent even wrote back to his mother about every single monument he saw and measured, which I'm sure she really enjoyed reading about. Another favourite activity on the Grand Tour was buying souvenirs. Did I say buying? I meant commissioning. Today we might take a selfie to commemorate that I, Mary, was here, but back in the 18th century, before the invention of the camera, the travel souvenir was a little bit more involved. This building was once the studio of a painter named Pompeo Battoni, and his specialty was painting grand tour portraits. And boy are they grand. Each portrait features the sitter in an elaborate studio setting, usually with some sort of Roman monument in the background or a classical style bust, sometimes surrounded by books and objects that show how learned he was. Pompeo Bertone was known for flattering his sitters, always making them look pretty attractive and noble. And because of this, anyone who was anyone wanted to have their portrait done by him. Most tourists would only visit Pompeo's studio once or twice to have some sketches made, and then the artist would ship their portraits back to England for them to receive when they got back at the end of their months or years abroad, or even direct to their families as a way to say, "Look what a great time I'm having in Rome, Mum." These types of lads, the column-measuring, portrait-commissioning type, dominated tourism in Europe for over a century. But by the 19th century, however, when old mate Augustus I'm not like the other tourists was writing, there was another type of tourist starting to flood into Europe in droves. Americans. And to Augustus, there was nothing worse. He said in Rome you would hear Americans describe the Forum as the dustiest heap of old ruins they ever looked upon. Or at the Colosseum, you'd hear them say that it will be a handsome building when it's finished. In the late 1800s, once America was done with its pesky little revolution and its civil war, the newly cashed up American upper class began flooding into Europe, especially to Rome. They wanted the social cachet of doing their own grand tour, but the English upper classes they mixed with in the tourist hotspots often saw Americans as brash and uncivilized. And although I largely still agree with them, I think it's important to point out that our posh British boys were probably feeling a little bit threatened by the influx of more diverse tourists to their favourite cities. Because in the second half of the 19th century, it wasn't just Americans that were flooding in, but also women. In the words of 18th century writer Samuel Johnson, a man who has not been to Italy is always conscious of an inferiority. But I'm not a man, and Samuel Johnson never actually went to Italy. So what I want to know is, what were the girlies up to? In order to find out, I'm going to call an expert.
Hello, Mum.
You see me?
No, I can't see you. I might need to turn on the video part. This is my mum.
I know, but where's that?
Contrary to popular belief, she wasn't around during the 19th century.
Microphone.
Next to that,
Start video, but it's got a cross through it.
but she has spent a fair bit of time researching some ladies who were. Yeah,
Really?
there you are.
Hi, Mary. I'm your mother. And her.
First of all, how long have you been doing family history research?
Well, since before you were born, so probably about 30 years.
How did you first come across the Cobden family?
Well, your 4 times great grandmother was a Cobden. Her brother was Richard Cobden, who was, in his day, he was internationally famous. First of all, for...
Mum can talk about Richard Cobden for hours, so here's the short version. Richard Cobden was a 19th century factory owner and a politician. He was famous because of his battle against this thing called the Corn Laws, laws that protected landowners in the United Kingdom by heavily restricting the import of grain from other countries. These laws were incredibly unpopular because when English crops failed, the price of food went up and people starved.
So his big ambition in life was to repeal those Corn Laws, which he finally achieved in 1846. He married and had several children, 2 of which are in that photograph you're going to talk about.
So far on this series, you'd be forgiven for thinking that travel in the 18th and 19th century was largely only for the posh boys, and you'd be right. Although some women also took part in the Grand Tour, they often had to travel with male chaperones like their husbands or fathers and didn't always have the same freedom that male Grand Tourists did. By the mid to late 19th century, however, this was all about to change, largely due to the rise of women's emancipation and the invention of the railway. And those 2 things are far more connected than you might initially think. These 2 ladies, for example, Jane and Annie Cobden, visited the Italian city of Siena in 1881, and they were photographed here at the studio of Paolo Lombardi. They also happen to be my ancestors.
To start with Jane, she was one of the first 2 women to be elected onto the London County Council. Jane was very much a supporter also of Irish Home Rule. She was also very passionate about South Africa, very much against the segregationist laws. laws that were brought in. And she didn't marry till she was about 42, and she married Fisher Unwin. He was known to be a radical publisher, and he published a lot of her father's works as well. Annie was a couple of years younger. She was a very strong suffragist. In fact, she wasn't a suffragist, she was a suffragette. A suffragist is a supporter of women's suffrage, so gaining the vote. A suffragette is someone that will resort to more militant means of achieving the same end. So Jane was a suffragist, but Annie was a suffragette. She was one of the women that was arrested for getting into the lobby of the House of Commons to present the Prime Minister and government with a petition. And she was thrown into Holloway Prison in 1906. She became a socialist, and she was also a wonderful speaker. And she went to America and gave a whole tour because the USA was even further behind in women's suffrage. And she had friends like Eleanor Roosevelt and people like that. So she moved in really interesting circles as well.
Why do you think they went to Italy? And what do we know about them as tourists?
They were quite experienced travellers from an early age. Jane had some of her early education in Paris. Annie had some of her early education in Germany. To say why they were in Italy, I have to take you back a little bit to after their mother died in, I think it was 1877. Their father had already died 12 years earlier. They came to live in Hammersmith, boarding with a family of George MacDonald, a Scottish writer. He was known to be quite a radical and very bohemian. George MacDonald and his family also lived for quite a bit of time in the late 1870s in Italy. I think that the girls, Annie and Jane, were perhaps visiting them as well. You might just also wonder about why Jane Morris is in the photograph.
Well, that's my next question.
Well, then again, we have to go back to Hammersmith.
For those playing at home, this is Jane Morris. You might recognise her from this painting, or this one, or this one. Jane was an embroidery artist of the arts and crafts movement, as well as an artist model for the pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Her husband was William Morris, the famous textile designer and socialist, and even if you've never heard of him, chances are you've seen his work on a tote bag or two.
So George MacDonald and his family, they lived in this house called The Retreat. Eventually they had to leave it, and William Morris and his family took over the lease, and the Cobden women who'd been living with the MacDonalds stayed on with the Morrises for a time. Here we have to link now into the man lying on the ground, Thomas James Sanderson. He was also a friend of the Morrises, and it is said that he coined the phrase art and craft movement that Morris was famous for.
This whole arty scene that the Cobden sisters were involved with in Hammersmith believed very strongly in making things by hand. Their artworks, textiles, homewares, prints and books all took heavy inspiration from the Middle Ages because they wanted to return aesthetically to a time before industrialisation. It was, if you like, the original cottagecore.
Siena being quite different to Florence and Rome, Rome with the sort of more classical antiquities and Florence with the Renaissance, high Renaissance work, etc. I think Siena was sort of regarded as, this is where you go to see medieval work. And I think that was more closely connected to the philosophies, I suppose, of the arts and crafts movement and the pre-Raphaelites, going back to a pre-Raphael time, literally.
What was happening in the late 19th century that allowed for more unmarried young women to travel to Italy?
Well, I suppose improvement in transport was one thing. Train travel would have had a big impact on not just women, but everybody being able to travel much more easily. I think the fact that the Cobden women had such great connections would have been a wonderful kind of passport. And also the fact that the women were suffragists. They believed in women's rights. They believed in women being able to be independent. It was part of their lived experience to travel, to be worldly, to be interested in international affairs. All those things supported their interest in travel.
It's hard to imagine the girls tackling these Sienese hills in those skirts, but can I just say, as a fellow lady traveller, I'm very grateful to them for paving the way for me and my grand tour today.
There's definitely a movie in this, Mary.
I'll write it one day.
It's time for me to leave the girls behind in Siena and continue back on my journey south through Italy to one of my final stops on my grand tour. Vedi Napoli e poi muori. See Naples and die. In the 18th century, perhaps quite literally. We all know the story of Pompeii, the Roman city buried under ash in 79 CE when Mount Vesuvius erupted. But did you know that although Mount Vesuvius is largely dormant today, throughout the 18th century it was actively erupting all the time? In the Grand Tour era, the city of Naples held a dangerous fascination for British tourists, not only because of the threat of destruction by this temperamental volcano, but also because it was during the 18th century that the first large-scale excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum were taking place. The Brits were obsessed. They wrote books, made paintings, and even wrote poetry about the drama of Vesuvius. And they travelled to Naples in droves to catch a bit of that danger for themselves. Naples at the time was the largest city on the Italian peninsula with a population of 400,000 people, and it became a favourite stop for grand tourists because there was supposedly less pressure on tourists to see all the sights like they did in Rome. What's more, the Roman excavations and artefacts that they were digging up painted a very different and sometimes shocking image of the ancient world than those on display in Rome. In Rome, the Forum and the Colosseum told a majestic story of democracy and civilization, but in Pompeii and Herculaneum, the two main archaeological sites of Naples, the discoveries were far more mundane and, at times, rather saucy. At Pompeii, they were discovering erotic fresco paintings and brothels, which shocked and concerned the English Protestants, along with many other everyday items that showed that the Romans were perhaps not all geniuses and gods, but just normal, everyday people like us. How shocking. The reason this was so confronting to the English tourists was because of the great mythology around Rome as the pinnacle of civilization, a civilization that Western Europeans believed they inherited. To be the cultural descendants of ancient Rome was to be rational, intelligent, and culturally refined, notions that were very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries at a time when Europe was actively colonizing other parts of the world. You see, in order to justify the subjugation of another people and culture, you have to really believe that your culture is superior. The uneasy truth that lies beneath the story of the Grand Tour is that this travel tradition was not only about the education of the privileged individual who took part in it, but also about the making of the mythology of Western civilization. I finally reached the end of my grand tour. On this journey, I've walked in the footsteps of the typical 18th century English gentleman and discovered that there was pretty much no place above his criticism. I saw the ugliest, beastliest town in the universe, survived wolf attacks and frostbite, admired the worst architecture I ever yet saw, and complained about all those other tourists getting in the way. Despite being whinging, often pompous posh boys, I still think we owe a small debt to the grand tourists of the 18th century for paving the way for modern day tourism. Today, of course, travel is safer, easier, and more accessible than it has ever been. And although we don't see visiting France and Italy as being that adventurous anymore, the cities of the Grand Tour are still some of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. Not only that, but the idea that travel widens your worldview and helps you grow as a young person certainly endures today in the form of the gap year. I'm now enjoying my last bit of sunshine before I head back home, and in the true Grand Tour spirit, I'm feeling worldly, educated, and above all, ready for a proper cup of tea.